so excited to have all of you with us today. So thank you for the time, thank you for being with us. Oh, there you go. I could
Just
pass
gonna close
Harry.
it, there's a lot of noise. Thank you. Hi, welcome. Love the necklace.
Oh, thank you.
Hi, I'm Barbara Ween, and yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't know you could sit next to me. Now I'm so lonely.
Run away from Barbara right now.
I want to welcome you around the circle. We have 51 people registered for this workshop, so that's why we're a little bit distant from each other right now, but we hope to create a very intimate, warm, and loving atmosphere. We don't use that word a lot in academia, but loving is the operative word here. And we want to know you, we want to meet you, we don't want anybody to be outside our circle with their backs to each other, so there's empty chairs at this point. I'm Barbara Ween, and I feel honored to be teaching with Robin Adams. She and I did a community action project in the wider city, waging peace with young people, teaching them nonviolent strategies to overcome despair in their communities. And she was magnificent, and I've learned so much from her. So I want to give a lot of kudos to you for partnering with me today, but also being a mentor and a leader on campus and in the city and in the world.
The feeling is deeply mutual. As you can tell, we have a lot of admiration for each other, especially because, you know, coming together around this kind of work, you know, relationships is everything. And so I am deeply appreciative of all the care and the relationship we've built over the years. So now that we finished loving up on each other, we'll love up on you a little bit.
Because the time is so short and we don't have, you know, the 16 weeks to build community with you, we wanted to do just a very light and lively introduction where you would all shout out at once, popcorn style, your name and where you're from on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. My name is Barbara Ween. I'm from Thank you. Nice to meet you. Obviously, that's highly inadequate, but it would take us all day to go around the circle and go deep with you. But we hope that you could turn to someone you don't know. Maybe you'd have to get up and out of the circle and cross the room. And identify with your partner one community in which you're engaged. What is one community where you are deeply engaged and have a sense of a support system? Can you name one? Just in pairs, quietly, for the next few minutes. If you could do that, please.
No, really? Okay, great. IOI. Excellent. So, what, like, where are you from here? What's the Well, I was thinking, I think I have, you know, my work is
I would say that there's always a sense of I'm still
That's what
Okay. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt on that. We are going to break you down into smaller groups a little bit later, so you'll have another opportunity to engage. I just want to be mindful of the time and keep us on schedule. We do have a schedule. I don't know how many of you received it over email on the website of the Fair and Teaching Conference and in the center of the room. So we tried to provide it in multiple formats for you. And we want to explain our rationale and justification for inviting you here today. And I think President Burwell set that up really nicely during lunch. That there are very high levels of anxiety, very high levels of despair, very high levels of mental depression, not just among young people, but arising in the United States. 50% of all deaths in the world today are now suicides. So something is going on, and I think we can guess what it is. That climate change is very, very disheartening and very upsetting for people, as are the headlines like this about national emergencies. So this kind of anxiety level and the kind of mean-spiritedness we've seen in societies. I work in international relations in particular, so we've seen the rise of 53 authoritarian regimes in the world that are cracking down on civil society, military occupations, this kind of thing. I'm dealing with a lot of heavy-duty things in my classes. I teach alternatives to war and violence, gender and peace building. So we're looking at macroeconomic trends, system trends, environmental trends, refugee, migration issues, and without a sense of history, without a sense of anchoring people in what has gone before, we could spiral into very depressive kinds of modes of thinking. So we proposed this workshop to come up with ideas, strategies, pedagogies for inspiring and motivating and uplifting our vision of the world by creating strong containers in the classroom, a very strong teaching environment where there is trust, there is hope, there is inspiration, and we draw strength from each other. And that is what I set out to do in my classes. That's what I have successfully done for the last 25 years. I can get a bit into my own background shortly, but we want to identify how can our classrooms be places of nurturing, of a sense of protection, and dare I say love. That we give our students a sense that we've been in this place before and we don't have to just accept that things are in an emergency, that people have joined forces to change the course of human events in history, and we need to borrow from those strategies. We need to remember that, and remember that we stand on the shoulders of giants before us. I always like to invoke the ancestors in the room, so I've put up Rosa, who you all know, Rosa Parks, and Wilma Mankiller. Do people know who Wilma Mankiller is?
Yeah.
Oh, do you want to say?
Oh, well, she was an Indian, I won't say chief, because she wasn't a chief, but she was very active in the Indian, Native American community.
She was, in fact, the chief,
Yeah,
of the Cherokee Nation, died of cancer.
Yeah.
Very, very powerful woman. She always said that her last name was a little bit scary, but that she was nonviolent. Eleanor Roosevelt, of course, and Harriet Tubman. So I like to invoke that, the elders in the room, to guide us both spiritually, intellectually, psychologically, economically, and they left their mark on history in very important ways. President Burwell wrote an article. How many of you read it in Foreign Affairs magazine? Oh, people have not read her article?
What's on the reading list? It's on the reading.
It's on the reading list, and she published it last fall, and it was quite the rage. So she was talking about how do we in the academy address high levels of anxiety? How can we harness the resources of higher education to be problem solvers and creative spirits out there and guide young people? We are, in fact, here on this campus to prepare young people for their futures. This is the dress rehearsal for their future. And how do we make the academy a place of joy? How do we make the students look forward to coming to class and have a sense of uplift and purpose and meaning? I like to say that the teacher is at the intersection of the private and the public space. We are the nexus between the private and the public. And so we also have to take that into account in our teaching. I'm going to get much more deeply into how I shape that, what the philosophies, pedagogies, and academic research are that guide me in this way. But I'd like Robin to have a chance to talk about why she partnered with me on the workshop as well.
Sure. So I'm an architect of first when it comes to a family. I come from a very Caribbean, very Guyanese, we are from the Caribbean, but we're actually located in South America kind of background. And so I said all that to say, when it comes to first, I was first to go to college, I was first to choose a career in social justice, I was the first to work in higher ed. And so for my family, that is a proud space for them and a deeply terrifying space for me most of the time. I don't feel like this is work that I do. I feel like this is work that I was called to do. So even days when I'm kicking and screaming, going like, no, I don't want to talk to nobody else. I don't want to struggle no more when it comes to these issues. But yet I will get up every day and do it joyfully most days because I feel like it is a calling. So that being said, I've only ever known a career working with justice. And so that's always been my come from and my framework with students, because you have to, whether it is that it's the figuring out the passion and what the calling is. And so that's kind of the space by which I work with them. And with them, whether it's that they know or they're figuring it out or whatever the case may be, but that place of feeling deeply empathetic for this journey that they're on, because I know what it is. Every day I feel like I get up and I'm doing it, with them. And so that was always the point of collaboration, but particularly around peace. So Barbara mentioned the first time we worked together, we worked with a group of young people where we had 100 of them, and we were working with them around peace education. And we took 100 of them plus their parents to New York. To go to New York and really be able to take what they were learning across 3 months in different workshops to go to the United Nations. A lot of them had not even left parts of Anacostia and Columbia Heights where most of them live, but we took them all the way to New York. And we didn't lose one. Brought them all back. We lost one for a little bit, but we found them and we brought them back with us. So that's kind of my, the space at which I come from. We'll never get it all done, we'll never get it all right, but we must be deeply committed to this kind of work. And so that path has taken me from working at rape crisis shelters, working at homeless shelters for young people, working abroad for many, many years, I worked in the Center for Community Engagement and Service. I am 10 days on the job working in CDI, the Center for Diversity and Inclusion, where I am responsible for our educational programs and training offerings. So once again, I just moved down the hall, but still here at AU and still believing in this kind of work. I also teach in the AUX program. the AUX2 program. So I spent a lot of time with our first year students, and this kind of the anxiety, not only around like who I'm gonna be, but on top of that, you want me to engage in these kind of issues that feel terrifying. You know, nothing like that first day of class, which I have, and some of you are probably there with me next week on Tuesday, 8 o'clock in the morning, where I say, you know, this is going to be great. And they're looking at me like, no, it's not going to be great, you know. But I think the underpinning for me, once again, is what I mentioned with Barbara, is that relationship piece. That they're free to make a mistake with me. They're free to get it wrong, because in the getting it wrong, they're getting it right. Like if you mess up some stuff, you are doing good. If you feel perfect and you don't feel unmoved and you feel comfortable, you're doing it wrong. And that's what I tell them all the time. You should feel a little bit terrified every day. That means you're risk-taking. You're just outside of your comfort zone. Now, don't freak out, you know, because then it's always like, you know, if you're so far out that you're freaking out, then you're not learning. But if you're just right on that edge, then they are learning and they're growing. And that's really what we want. And that they're growing in a way that really allows them to be culturally competent, engaged, creating inclusive environments with themselves and with us in our classrooms and beyond. And so that's what drives me. I love this work. And, you know, I assume because you showed up here, you guys love it too. You know, I'm going to make that assumption. Go with me. Okay, so Barbara, back to you.
Thank you. So our expectations for the workshop would be that we would be very elicitive. We would elicit ideas from you, share our best practices, what has worked well, what has failed. We learn most from our mistakes, right? What our philosophies and values are underlying. But we'd like to hear from you for the next few minutes. Do you have specific takeaways you'd like to have from this workshop? And I'm just going to write these up on the flip charts while Robin facilitates. Are there any expectations or a specific objective or goal that you'd like to take from the workshop?
Yeah, and as you thought about this session and you signed up for it, some of you, you know, early on, what were you thinking that you might hope to get out and walk out this room with? Yes.
Well, I'm starting to teach for the first time here at School of Communications this coming semester. Some of my work touches on some very sensitive topics because I look at extremism, political and religious extremism, and you know, building an inclusive and safe classroom is a challenge that's especially important for me to tackle.
Yes.
I'm very interested to know about anyone's take on how to build community and communities of caring while understanding for me that that's been counterculture to sometimes DC, Washington DC culture, and higher ed as a whole in terms of being very focused on grades and even the ways that certain faculty are treated in terms of ratings and things like that. So how do we realistically build this with those kind of pressures in mind?
Well, yeah, this is an area that's a high priority for me as a professor, and so I'm excited to hear about new strategies and ideas because it's so difficult, and I'm just always so surprised with, you know, the intentions that I come in as a professor and all the barriers and the walls around students, and how it's not, we can have the best intentions, but it can be very difficult to create that community. And I can understand why not everybody wants to come to my house for dinner or meet me at a museum on the weekends, or a couple things that I've tried to do to get that community feeling going, but there's, you know, resistance and just kind of socialization to be more private and distant and aloof, and how you kind of overcome that.
That's a great one, you know, because we're all thinking, this is a great, once again, like me in my class, this is a great idea. We're all going to go to the movies together. And students are like, no. I've actually tried that one.
It's kind of
I actually tried that one. It was like, you know, what was it? Wakanda came out. I was like, yeah, let's all Wakanda together. They were like, no.
Yeah, I was really looking forward to talking about how to think about building local community connections with our students that aren't just exploitative or don't just serve the students, but also serve the local communities, or actually center the needs of the local communities and let students learn that way.
You guys are awesome. You're lining up with where we're going. It's always, a risk take to say, what do you want? And we're like, well, we hope we gave you that. But yes, it is great. Other thoughts? Yes.
Yeah, well, I have realized in the years that the classroom becomes more and more diverse.
Mm.
You have everything, and I'm teaching over the last 7 years, or last 8 years, and my question here is strategies on making the classrooms, safe and comfortable between the students, because it's not only that relationship between us, the professor, and the students, also between them, that they create a community and are good with each other, because of the diversity, which I think is fantastic, that we have the diversity, and makes them feel that it's fantastic, that it's the community. How do we create a community in between them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the word, if I could add to that, is intentional. Right, because some students will create their own communities for whatever. Some we like, some we don't like, but that we are as instructors, as leaders, supporting them in creating intentional, inclusive communities.
Yeah, and the voice is cliquish.
Yeah, to avoid that. Yeah, awesome. Other?
Yeah, I think this has been said before, but one way to ask the question is like, how do you provoke without alienating? Also, I'm curious about what others have had experience. We all have our biases, for lack of other word, and I'd like to be honest about my biases with my students, but I don't know sometimes whether that should be at the top of the class, the first class. Here are my biases, but it's okay for you to disagree with them. So that's been the question of my career, basically.
We are so simpatico in this room, and we're really on the same wavelength around what we're going to try to achieve today.
And
more? Do we have other
thoughts before we? I feel like this is a pretty robust list there.
Yeah.
In terms of where we're going. Some of the wants, desires, expectations that you've listed, we're going to outright speak to in terms of our pedagogy and its exercises that we do in classes and how we approach things, and even in how we started out with you all, that you're sitting in a circle. How many of you have been to a session where you sat in a circle today? Yeah?
Today?
Yeah? Today.
Not today.
Just
no.
today at the Anfaring Conference, because a lot of you have been in various sessions. I saw a lot of rows today, and just even in changing the structure of your classes. Now, some of you can't, because, you're in those stationary rooms and you can't move those chairs. And there are opportunities for you to actually move the bodies that are in the chairs. So for moments where I'm in a classroom where we can't move the chairs, we actually move our bodies around. Sometimes that's within the hallway spaces, sometimes that's in other spaces where it makes sense and it aligns with what you have, the learning objectives for that day. But so we start we'll be modeling some things for you, so feel free to ask why, because if it feels a little different. And then some things we'll be speaking outright in an effort to meet some of these goals. In the interest, time is always something we're racing against. So we'll try as much as we can to also footnote a lot of things as we're going as well.
So, why a circle? What does a circle represent? Equality.
Community.
Community. Openness. Connections.
Collaboration.
Collaboration.
Looking at each other.
Looking at each other. Others?
We're all in this together.
Yeah, nice. There's a huge body of literature around this about doing democracy in circles. And in terms of excellence and higher ordered thinking and academic rigor, it also offers us accountability. Architecture really makes a difference in the classroom. Because when students are sitting in rows, they could be surfing the internet or texting their friends, but that's very difficult in a circle. I've put out a few reasons why we work in a circle. So accountability is huge. We're accountable to each other, and we're out there. I mean, we're transparent. There's nothing between us. There's no desks between us, tables, whatnot. It also emphasizes listening. You kind of have to listen when you're in a circle because people don't check out as easily. It honors all voices. I think some of you touched on that already. It's inclusive. It equalizes power. I am sitting in the circle right along with everybody else. I'm not standing behind a lectern. I'm not behind a desk. It's not the banking method of learning where I'm going to deposit my wisdom into your empty account. It's that there is a richness. This is a learning circle. We all draw from each other. We also draw strength from each other. It's reflective and respectful. Somebody already said builds relationship. It evaluates our best it elevates our best selves. So let's say we're having a really controversial topic, like you're going to provoke, right? Instead of people digging in, we have found through the research that in a circle, people are willing to engage in dialogue. It's not debate, it's not discussion, it's dialogue. And they're like, okay, I'm going to listen. I may not agree with you, but let's try and work this out. A circle facilitates that much better than any other way of organizing your classroom. So we can be in conflict. It's fine to be in conflict. And Parker Palmer writes a lot about this in the literature, in the educational literature. His famous book is called Sitting in the Fire. You want to have conflicts around the group, in the circle, because that's how healthy groups move forward. You harness the conflict to move a healthy group forward. We don't have to be afraid of conflict. Circles make conflicts more peaceful. It also offers relationships, interconnectedness. We can take risks, and it's okay. But we also see circles in nature. Everywhere we look, we see circles in nature. Can you name some of them?
The sun?
The sun. Where else? We're standing on a circle. Right, right. Fruit is circular. The womb and the birth canal are circular. I mean, everything around us we should be honoring as circles. So that's just one small pedagogical thing, I would say, that can help spread trust and possibly get people to step out a little bit instead of all the walls and barriers that you mentioned. It's just one small technique. The other thing is that I am very intentional about my values. I am never apologetic about my values. And I don't expect students to necessarily share those values, but I will be very upfront about them and hope that they can inspire. And students have said to me that I'm the only teacher that ever did values clarification with them. They said, wow, you're the only professor I've ever talked to, or teachers in their high schools that actually were explicit about their values orientation. So I say my values are, I'm trying to create a more peaceful future for you. I'm trying to interrupt cycles of violence wherever they may occur in the world, legal violence, gender violence, racial violence, environmental violence, whatever that violence is, I'm going to come up with creative alternatives to interrupt those cycles of violence. I also embrace wholeheartedly social justice. I think we need to live in a fair society. Economic well-being. Everyone should be able to prosper and meet their full human potential. People should not be struggling for health care, housing, food, and the starvation in the world. We need to have an economic system where everybody can put their best foot forward and be industrious and have well-being. Ecological balance. We currently have no balance. in the world. We need to restore our relationship with the natural environment. We need to heal the planet. I'm very upfront with them about that, and I believe in democratic participation. I am not for fascism, and I am not for authoritarianism, and I won't have an authoritarian classroom. So hopefully all of this will be reflected in how I teach, and the materials I choose, the authors I choose. If war is a problem to be solved, then peace is a value to be realized. And I think students appreciate when we reveal our biases. I come out of nonviolent social movements. I have served as an unarmed bodyguard in war zones around the world with Peace Brigades International, Christian peacemaker teams, a variety of other groups, and I also serve as a nonviolent peacekeeper here in Washington, D.C. to walk side by side with kids so that they don't get hurt in inner cities. And I did a lot of that work in the 80s and 90s in Columbia Heights, where I lived for 12 years, and in Harlem before that. Some of the influences on my teaching come out of the peace movement, and I'm very upfront with my students about that, that I was living in community with those who were willing to put their lives at risk on behalf of the vulnerable. My graduate work was in the origins of social courage and the origins of genocide. What helps people to stand up for the rights of others, whereas others will be bystanders? What is the psychological, academic, neurological literature and research around that? I was lucky enough to win a National Kellogg Fellowship, and I went all around the world studying why people stuck their necks out at great personal risks to protect the lives of others. Irvin Staub is one of the most famous psychology professors at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, who has done the most extensive research and literature on this. He wrote The Origins of Altruism, The Origins of Genocide. What we found through the research and the literature are role models. Role models, people who were brought up to believe not only in the rights of others, but they had adults in the community that were willing to stick their necks out. I don't know if any of you ever read Weapons of the Spirit or saw the movie Weapons of the Spirit. A young Jewish boy, little boy, goes back to the village in Schomburg, asks, why did the French village save 4,000 Jews from the Nazis at great personal risk? And they said, of course, what else would we do? Well, it turns out they too had been persecuted as Huguenots long ago, but also they had a young priest in the community that was willing to stand up for the rights of the Jews, and they hid 4,000 Jews. That young priest was taken out into the center of the square and beheaded in front of the village by the Nazis. The village never gave up their Jews. And we have stories of that from all over the world, of Palestinians protecting Israelis, of Israelis protecting Palestinians, of Croats protecting Bosnians, et cetera, et cetera. I don't have time to go into the whole history. But if we could bring those stories of social courage to the fore for our students, they can understand more. Now, these are individual stories, and I want to connect it to larger movements. So I unfurl a giant banner across the room, a blank scroll of paper all on the walls of the room, and we begin to map the course of human events where people have intervened to interrupt cycles of violence and injustice. We start way back in biblical times, and by the end of the semester, they have filled out a timeline of the human race, of non-violent social movements, of social justice movements. They unearth that on their own, through their own research and through readings. But I try to create space in the curriculum and in the syllabus for them to bring their own readings to our attention, for them to be deeply engaged in doing research, because they have access to young people's literature that I might not be reading, novels and poetry and slam poetry and rap and so many new younger authors, and maybe from other genres I've never been exposed to. So the other early influences on my teaching and pedagogy is Maria Montessori. How many of you know who she was? Okay, she was the first woman to ever graduate with a medical degree in Europe in the late 1800s, and she was a single mother. She had to hide her illegitimate son from the world, and she had to do the autopsies and whatnot by herself in the operating theater because she was a woman. She wasn't allowed to be with the male medical doctors or students with the corpses. Anyway, she went on to start schools for the poor all over Naples and all over the world, and Montessori schools today. The major thing I want you to take away from Maria Montessori is that students should have an intrinsic love of learning. We shouldn't be driving the classroom. It should always be about student-centered pedagogy. We are simply meant to be facilitators quietly in the corner. Maria Montessori went on to win the Nobel Peace Prize. She was one of the first women to ever win the Nobel Peace Prize. She's written so many books. And Gandhi invited her to India saying, you know, you're a very elite woman, why don't you try and come and work with the untouchables, the Dalits in India? And she went. She went to India. And thank God Gandhi invited her, because as soon as Hitler took power in Europe, the first thing he did was to shut down all the Montessori schools. Why would he do that? Because they fostered critical thinking. And she would have been killed along with others under Mussolini and Hitler if she hadn't been in India with Gandhi. And her stories is pretty amazing, and I won't have time to go into it. Also, Betty Reardon is a famous peace educator I studied with at Columbia University Teachers College. Paulo Freire, I also got a chance to study with him. George Lakey, who's an amazing Quaker who started the movement for a new society in Philadelphia. I think the biggest influence on me were tribal colleges. I got to work with many tribal leaders and tribal teachers at community colleges in tribal lands, and they taught me a lot about community. But they said, don't use our pain for your gain. Use stories of resistance. We have so many stories of resistance in Native American communities, and that's what you should be teaching. How are people resilient in the face of genocide? I mean, let's face it, that's what we committed in North America. Howard Zinn, I obviously featured him very strongly on the agenda, and I share with you that quote because in the face of everything he went through in the civil rights movement with friends and family and at Spelman College, he still hung on to humanity. How do we hang on to our humanity? How do we show our kids and our students how to hang on to humanity? People know who Paulo Freire is, right? And he worked with core movements. And Howard Gardner. Howard Gardner gave us this multiple intelligence theory. Of course, Maria Montessori invented it 120 years before him, but she never gets credit for it. But he says all of us have these intelligences, and our teaching should draw that out. We should be appealing to the whole child, to the whole student, in all of their sensory perceptions, not just linear, logical methods of learning. And again, I don't have time to go into all of this because I want to leave time for Robin as well. But we should be using music. We should be using poetry and dance. We should be using kinesthetic methods of learning. People should be up and out of their chairs, writing on the walls, creating together in teams. All these different methods of learning. Interpersonal, have them journaling, have them teaching, and very importantly, having them go out into the community to harness the resources of higher education to solve problems. But the one thing that Howard Gardner left out was the highest form of emotional intelligence, which is empathy and compassion. That's missing from this academic theory. And to look at how can we identify with the suffering of others. And so in all of the work that I do with my students, I try to foster that. And I try to get them out of the classroom to do that. So when our African American students were under threat here on campus with nooses and bananas and hate speech and all this kind of stuff, I said, what would be the greatest thing I could do for my students to give them resilience and courage? I said, you know what? I'm going to invite the Freedom Riders to campus. Some of them actually hung out on this campus in the 60s. And so my students organized a teach-in, and I had them be the facilitators and them be the speakers. And they brought back the original Freedom Riders to campus. And we did an all-day teach-in with Dion Diamond, Reggie Green, Joan Mulholland, and of course the first thing that the Freedom Riders did was sing. They said you can't have movement without singing. And so that we did so many incredible songs, but Before I Be a Slave, I'll Be Buried in the Grave was one of the most powerful. And they, of course, sustained themselves in prison and in jail through music when they thought they were going to be killed. And I have to tell you that this gave my students so much strength. Having the elders come back, invoking the elders. These folks were imprisoned in the worst penitentiary in Alabama. And they were beaten to within an inch of their lives. I don't need to teach you the history of the civil rights movement, right? But they were beaten with chains, and their buses were set on fire, and so much happened to them, and yet they persisted. They persisted. And for my students to see people their same age in the lockup and in the penitentiaries and with the mug shots was very powerful. And there they were in their 80s and 90s singing with us. So that was a community action program that I did with them. I got out of the way. I just shut up and let the students teach and learn. The darkening was very, very helpful in that regard. Here's Joan, and she's with Martin Luther King, and so many others, and here she is today. I also took my students to Selma, Alabama, and we marched across the bridge for the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Movement, and then we marched to Montgomery. And it was so powerful because people came out, gave us food, we had tents set up, and we were marching with the icons of the Civil Rights Movement. And then we caravanned on to Ferguson to bear witness to police brutality up there. And my students, my graduate students in international peace and conflict resolution, served as facilitators for restorative justice circles, what they called truth-telling in Ferguson. They said, we're not ready for reconciliation with the police. We want truth-telling. So that was very powerful to do the march from Selma to Montgomery, to go to Ferguson, to apply all these theories of peace and conflict out in the community, in our nation. Of course, we did it all in circles in Ferguson, and for the students to connect with the elders and draw strength from the elders. They gave a lot of beautiful advice. My students are also really, really distraught about the refugee situation and immigrants. And this started 4 years ago, not just the current situation. I couldn't bring all the props from what we did, but we blew up an inflatable raft, and we did an all-day teach-in on Syria, peace, and refugees. We brought in community-based groups and advocacy groups like UNHCR, and we had life jackets and passports and money. We said you have 3 minutes to choose between your shoes, your kid, your passport, and your money. You have to all get into this lifeboat and somehow escape the war in Syria. And the folks who came from the State Department were fantastic, the Office of Population, Migration, and Refugees, and so many teach-ins, so many community action programs that my students have organized. I just try to give them the space when we can't fit it into the syllabus, when we can't get all of the lesson plans that we hope to accomplish in the course of the regular semester. I book a room, get them the resources, bridge out into the community, and try to give them opportunities to follow their concerns and their passions. I offered you a whole bunch of exercises in the handouts that I gave you to build trust so that students can find their voice in this regard. I don't know how many of you saw some of these exercises. I sort of went to the final outcome before I gave you all the lead up to it. But if you could go back to the objectives, here's the objectives for these exercises. To build healthy group dynamics is huge. For better learning outcomes, and this is what the neurological and psychological research shows, that when our students are stressed, they cannot retain, they cannot put their best foot forward, right? When we create a more peaceable atmosphere, peaceable classroom, peaceable community, they are able to advance their own excellence. I want my students to look forward to coming to class. I want them to find it enjoyable, and their ratings show that it is. And we have to be creative, and we have to get them up and out of their chairs. Some of this I'm repeating myself. So I offered you just 6 exercises here that I've used successfully with students. Did everybody get those? They're on the website. I emailed them to you if you had registered for this session, and then I printed them out. I'll just give you the final one, exercise number 5, if people could share those. In this time of crisis and change, it is hard for me to be alive because ... and they choose in pairs to answer that question. Why is it difficult during this particular period in human history to be alive? What is it that makes them feel this way? Then I appreciate being alive right now because ... They have to finish that sentence in pairs. And then if I examine my life, I see I take part in healing the world in the following ways. And so I put the onus back on the students, what makes you feel alive, what makes you feel hopeful, but also that to be human is to suffer. You're going to have hurt feelings, you're going to have times of despair, but how can we act on it? I have known people who have lost their children to political violence, and it's what they did with that tragedy that made the most positive impact in the world. So how many of you know who Rachel Corrie was? 2 people. You want to say who she was?
Is she the one who was killed in Israel by a bulldozer?
Yeah. She was crushed to death by an Israeli bulldozer, and the bulldozer driver just didn't run her over. He backed up and crushed her again. She was trying to protect Palestinian homes from the bulldozers. How many of you know who Amy Beale was? Okay, she was a young white woman that was trying to dismantle apartheid in South Africa, and she was dropping off a black friend one night, and boys in the township killed her. Now, in both these instances, the families set up foundations in the name of their children who were killed. Amy Beale's parents invited the young men who had killed her to be on the board of the foundation. So they took something that was so tragic, and they said, don't sell these young men to prison in South Africa under apartheid. They'll probably die in prison. No, we want them to atone, and practice reconciliation, but we also want to give them opportunities so that this never happens again. There is hard times in the world. I think we have to be really intellectually honest with our students around that. We are not living in a normal time right now. We have to say that out loud. That's the first thing I said the day after the election. Because I was looking at my students, it looked like they had been hit by a train. And I said, I'm not going to pretend that everything's normal, because everything is not normal right now. And so I think the more honest, the more transparent, the more explicit we are with our students, but also giving them the space to pursue their interests and to talk about it. Most of these exercises on here are fun. They're supposed to be fun and enjoyable, but they're also very serious. You can get more and more serious. How many of you have played Which Way Does the Wind Blow? Okay, you played that. So there's not enough chairs around the circle, somebody's in the middle, and you ask funny questions, silly, frivolous questions, and everybody who agrees with that question has to get up and run around and find an empty chair. Of course, there aren't enough. But the fun questions then become more and more serious. And this is how we begin to break down the walls and the barriers that you were talking about and referring to earlier, that sense of separateness. So which way does the wind blow for someone who's lost someone to gun violence? And you'd be surprised how many people get up and run across the circle. How many of you have lost somebody in war? So we start off on the superficial, but over the course of the semester we go deeper and deeper. These are just the tip of the iceberg of what I do in class. I will email this out to you if you didn't get it. But I do hold my students accountable by them grading their own participation. I also emailed this out to you. That they have a presence and engagement sheet, and every class they rate themselves. How much did they contribute to the discussion? How much did they feel that people in the class were actually doing the readings and going deep on the readings? And at the end of the semester, we total this up and they give them their own self-grading. People are in shock. I mean, students are shocked that they're grading themselves. I mean, it's one of many factors I offer. Of course, they don't give themselves their entire grade. But they're much more mindful about their participation. They're much more mindful about their contributions to the class. And they're also rating me, every single class. How well did I do? And how well did the whole group do? I want to stop there because I want to make sure that you have time to speak. There's many other techniques, trust building, community building, going out into the community, bringing back lessons learned. One thing that we did was called Localizing Peace, where we went out to all of the frontline service providers, rape crisis shelters, child care centers, and we asked them, what is your role in building a more peaceful society? And they said, we're not peace builders. And we said, actually you are. Without you, the social fabric of our society would be completely torn asunder. And then we gathered all of them together to meet each other. This was through the graduate program in IPCR with Abdulaziz Saeed. Many, many models we have in the community of how we've tried to bridge back all the lessons learned from youth who are experiencing violence in DC back to campus and have a symbiotic relationship and a two-way street. Yes?
I just wanted to say something really quickly.
Please.
Our time's limited.
No, I was going to open it to questions because that was a lot of information, a lot of different things to take in. So I want to give you guys a chance to ask some questions. So please.
Yes, it's more just a reflection for myself in like engaging in these kind of really radically honest and loving kinds of conversations. Something that comes up for me as a person of color is that for some of us, it's not that shocking what's happening in our country. It's more that it's just being much more revealed, more tangibly. So just for folks in the room who maybe haven't had these kind of conversations, is to also know that like for some students with marginalized identities, just so that like my experience isn't being used as a teaching moment all the time. That sometimes it's going to be really hard. Maybe I have been affected by gun violence, but I don't want to step in. And just to be mindful of those dynamics as well as to like what you are asking people to share and how before maybe like that kind of trust has been built. And to also acknowledge that for some of us, certain things might be more shocking than others because of privilege or the ways that like I embody certain identities that I don't have to think about all the time. So just to bring some complexity into that, but so appreciate these kinds of conversations because more often than not, I have benefited.
I think that's an excellent point. And once we take a few more questions and input, I'll talk a little bit a model that builds kind of a little bit kind of builds on what you're talking about there. Yeah.
I really appreciate your presentation, and as you know, Barbara, I've invited you to speak to my class a couple of times because you're absolutely wonderful. But I've noticed that when I've tried to do some of these things with my foreign policy class, I get a lot of pushback because my student body in that class tends to approach the course in a very Westphalian national interest kind of perspective. You know, we are all Americans and this is US foreign policy. And so being a person of a minority myself, sometimes there's also some resistance to my introducing perspectives that they hadn't considered before. And for instance, just to give you an example, I asked them to memorize a poem from World War I, from the poets of World War I, when we were discussing that issue and the effect that World War I has had in human history since then. It's a nightmare that has never ended. Boy, the evaluations were great. The kids were furious that I had, asked them to do something so silly as to memorize a poem. I thought it was kind of a gift, guys, I'm telling you ahead of time, you have plenty of time, just, choose a short poem, memorize it, and write it on the exam, and you get 5 points, it's bonus. No, they didn't like it. They didn't like when I introduced all of these themes and issues and methodologies. It was like, this is not peace and conflict resolution, this is American foreign policy, and what are you doing with us? And so how do I make students in my field become more empathetic?
Right.
That American foreign policy is not just about the American national interest, but world interest and peace and values that...
Did you want to speak to that?
Oh, no, I just had a different question.
Oh, okay.
Sure.
Well, I don't think we can make them, and that's what that article was about. That it wasn't enough for us to just offer role models, but that we actually had to assign it with our students to get outside their comfort zone, to go out and do something for credit that's going to rearrange the furniture in their head, and provoke. Like Zinn was saying, we do need to provoke. We do need to offer them other experiences than they would normally have. That's our role, is to push the limits and boundaries of their thinking. I know my professors did it when I was growing up, and I went through all the stages of death and dying. I grew up with my nose pressed up against a limousine window. Okay, my father was a chief information and cultural officer for the United States Embassy in Rome, Naples, Jakarta, Indonesia, and many other places. So I grew up in a life of privilege, and I got to campus, and my professors were teaching me all this foreign policy that was like, the CIA assassinated our Benz, and we supported Sabak in Iran, and I went through all the stages of death and dying. I was so angry with them. I was like, that's not true. I mean, my father's a foreign service officer, blah, 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 blah. And I was so angry with them that sometimes I didn't go to class. But I recognized what was happening to me. First I went through anger, then I went through denial. I guess denial's first. Then I went through bargaining, and finally because my professors were great role models, they said, if you don't like what you're hearing, roll up your sleeves and do something about it. And that's where the action component comes in. So I think we can't be people pleasers. We can't be their best friends. People are going to dislike what we say sometimes. I will tell you that when I offer a whole different paradigm around how we could defend our rights and defend our territories without bloodshed and war, it's the soldiers in my class that agree with me the most. They've just come back from Iraq and Afghanistan. That's true. So use resources that might be in your classroom to have them. But I think it's the stories. The stories are what's going to turn them around. If they could hear from people directly affected by U.S. foreign policy, then maybe that would put a little chink in their thinking.
I also think that, we're at a place with this generation and where students are wanting to learn differently, and they want to be a collaborator in their learning. And I think sometimes that's hard for faculty, especially since we come in, we have all this research, all this expertise. And so things like surveys, assessments, your first couple of classes where you're kind of engaging with them to get a sense of who they are. So we kind of started out talking about this ideas of being transparent with who we are. They also have to be transparent with the kind of learner they are. And so having those kinds of building and framing conversations early on in the classroom, both some of which, like one of the things I do with my students is I send them out a survey with different questions, and some of them are like, this is some strange questions, as we are kind of getting to know each other in not ways traditionally where we play these get to know you games, some of which we do that, and that's necessary, and we've given you some great examples, but in terms of a survey around where they have to think about who they are, and I'm coming into the classroom telling them who I am. You know, so we're a collaborator around this learning. So some students will say, I hate group projects. So we'll talk about what it is to hate about and what the value is, and we will collaborate around what some options might be. And I know it seems a little crazy and it doesn't always work for every single discipline, but I would assert that it can work for most of our classrooms, that collaboration where faculty and student meet around their learning. At the end of the day, it is their learning.
Yeah.
They have to carry forward. If they have no ownership for it, if they have no passion for it, if they have no investment in it, and they're just in a classroom to say, okay, I'm going to check the box, then I feel like we have failed. So one of the things that that we're kind of, sort of wrapped to, and I want to pivot us to is around how this piece around community engagement as a way of engaging students in their learning, but also a bridge back to campus and a sense of belonging and inclusiveness that happens. So life pieces to masterpieces is another example. Barbara gave you some great examples of what happens in the classroom and what she's done with students. These are some other examples both that happen through our community-based learning program, also through our initiatives like DC Reads, and other initiatives that really are high-impact learning type models that fuse all these pieces together that we're talking about. So Andrew Brickle, who's actually over here to my left, is going to talk a little bit about our Life Pieces, Masterpieces collaboration. This is a program that we built with one of our community partners and that has been at AU for a very long time. They work both on and off campus, and it allows our students to really take ownership for learning through engagement. You want to talk a little bit about
Yeah, well, thank you both for inviting me. And so I work at Life Pieces to Masterpieces. Very briefly, we're a mentorship program for boys in Ward 7. Our purpose is to provide opportunities for African American males ages 3 to 25 to discover and activate their innate creative abilities to change challenges into possibilities. This program's been around for 23 years, and we've partnered with AU for 15.
15 up to 23?
Yeah. And so for all 23 of those years, it's been a safe space for boys where they know they're loved, they know they're cared for, and they know they're free to express themselves, because that is something that boys, especially growing up, don't always have the opportunity to think it's okay to express my emotions and things like that. So how do we work with AU? Through DC Reads is a program that every student at AU is able to sign up for, but also through your own courses, whether that's a CBL course, or if you don't have the time in your syllabus to do some of these great projects, just know that all your students can get this community-based add-on credit where they could come volunteer and create some amazing project with us, similar to what your class would be working on themselves, in case you can't put that in your syllabus based on time concerns. And one bias that I want to talk about when we think about, okay, I think it's very important that when we come into other communities that we're making sure that our collaboration will be mutually beneficial. But as long as we have that idea in our mind, we can collaborate together, and it will be so. One of our biases is that we think of communities that serve and communities that get served. And so often when we talk about a group of boys from Ward 7, one of the harshest communities in DC, they are a community that gets served. But when we talk about why service is important and what it helps, we know that my students want to participate in community service. They want to help people. They want to make people's lives better. So for AU students to come into our program and volunteer, not only are they serving the community, they're benefiting from it in all these ways and building their own community and building their own love and empathy. But our guys get to have the experience of helping college students. A 5-year-old can know I helped a college student become a better student. And those are, that's a really powerful thing when that dialogue and that relationship can be built in a way that they understand that. So it's always beneficial to have such a diverse range of of students from different disciplines. We have a science class that comes in and teaches our boys science. We have, sociology students come in. We have education students who are assistant teachers and help with our high schoolers who are junior mentors. So there are ways, and there are other organizations besides ours, of course. There are so many ways to get your students involved in the community.
Right, and so the whole sort of, what you hear us kind of beating this drum around is that there has to be that engagement piece. No matter what the students are studying, we found that they really are asking for a different types of models where they can do both these things. And so one of the things that we know is this high impact learning is essential, and so we see that these types of programs and how we bridge to them out to the community and then back really supports high impact learning, where students are we're able to make things relevant for them. We're giving them that kind of problem, that problem based and the ability to solve things that we're letting them do by learning, that they're able to be social, they feel like it's meaningful, they're out there. So whether it's like, I'm in a math class and I hate this math class, all of a sudden they love, if you teach math, it's not, I like math. That they all of a sudden go from I hate math, but when they have to learn it, because they have to teach it to a young person, and then that young person is like, at the same time, they are feeling like, I'm helping you get a better grade because I'm trying to learn this math, so we are in this thing together.
Right.
So all of a sudden, we're all in it together as a community. They're in it to win it, in terms of their studies. We're in it to win it with them as their faculty. The kids are in it to win it for themselves with them. And it's that kind of community collaboration that really makes the social pieces work, and being self-directed and being able to really contextualize all this. And so, I said all that to say is that in these, particularly these programs that we've kind of highlighted today that Andrew and I are talking about, and then in context with Barbara mentioned some and that we've collaborated with, these are sort of places, so you don't necessarily have to feel like, okay, well, I have to redo my whole syllabus and I have to try to fit all this in, or with all the other stuff and all of that. What we're saying is that there are resources here at the university where we've been doing this for a very long time, where we have modules just about for every class that can work. And it simply is a sit-down conversation with us, whether it's as colleagues to talk about, how can I switch some things up, or what can I add slowly, or whether it's with our colleagues in the Center for Community Engagement and Service, or our colleagues in CDI, Center for Diversity and Inclusion, all are invested in having this outcome. So I will I think I missed, I missed that slide somewhere, but so what I would say about all of this is, we find that especially students who are involved in a lot of these programs learn best when they really are able to, have that context, kind of see it in larger goals, see where the need is, connect it to their ambitions and goals, really be able to also connect it to past experiences. Especially for me, as a first gen, college became way more meaningful for me when I could actually give it back, where I could pay it forward. And all of a sudden I felt a lot more engaged, because up until that point I was, college seemed like it really wasn't a place for me, but then it all made sense of how it would come together. And then, the other pieces, the last two pieces I would say is that it's really interactive and fun. And Barbara mentioned that. It's kind of like an edutainment. It's one of the things that we say, especially to the young people in this program, is that it doesn't have to kill them slowly. I can't tell you how many students say, I'm in this class and it's killing me slowly. It should be invigorating them. It should be giving them life. So whatever those pieces are that you might want to examine amongst the offerings that we've given you, and there's so much more that we could tell you. And then finally, just really, the last piece is relating it to whatever specific goals that they want to achieve, and those are those life goals that we can connect and inspire to. So,
we had a hand here.
Yeah.
I'm sorry we didn't get to your question earlier.
I think in a way you kind of answered the question, because my question was when you were talking about your, the strategies that you use in your course to sort of like build community, and then I was like, it was highly related to what your interests were, and that some of like your topics that your topic of your course, but then I was thinking about what about those professors who like their topic is like totally different, so like how do they still like invoke that same atmosphere to create that community where they can't just heavily rely on a sort of like their discipline, and so that was where the question, but then you came in and started talking about sort of like that community based learning aspect of the course, to be able to see, okay, like this is what we learned in our course, and then how we could apply these issues to our local community to sort of like create that empathy, that community among students as well. So I think sort of like that's where I got from the connections, so you kind of answered. I don't know.
And I've even seen, statistics professors having their students figure out how the cost of the wall on the Mexico-US border would work out, and the math and statistics around that. So they took the students' passions and they applied it in the content of their course, just providing openings of that nature. So I think creating scholarly knowledge together in a democratic way could open up people's thinking when it doesn't always necessarily seem apparent.
I want to, because we're actually right on time, right up to our time here where we have to let everyone go. So I do want to say that, thank you for your time. We'll still be here, continue the conversation, still continue to build for those of you who want to hang out a bit with us. But we want to thank you for your time with us today. Time is one of the most generous and greatest gifts that we can give, because you can't get it back. And once you give it, it's gone. So we want to thank you for all that you gave to us today. Please do fill out your evaluations. Let us know how we did. We love the critical feedback. And feel free to drop it in the box there. But hang out with us if you don't have another session, or you should, but feel free to hang out with us. I do want to kind of give a pivot towards the dialogue program that is housed in the Center for Diversity and Inclusion. Michelle, will you wave at everybody? Michelle Strange, who's back there, is in charge of our dialogue program. It's a fantastic program. She's always willing to come into your classroom and kind of talk about that. So she's back there if you want to kind of talk to her about the dialogue program. Can you give us like a 10-second kind of what dialogue is for the group, especially if they're thinking about other offerings into their classes as well?
Intergroup Dialogue is a program that gathers small groups of people together to talk about issues of identity from a personal and systemic level. And a lot of faculty are offering extra credit or an option to replace an assignment for students to participate in this 7-week program. And it increases learning in and out of the classroom, but also makes the classroom discussions better. So come and talk to me if you're interested in promoting Intergroup Dialogue, having us come to your class, or offering extra credit for participation.
Thank you. Awesome. 10 seconds. Thank you guys so much. Thank you for being with us all today. Thank you, friends.